over the last 10 years, but been thrilled and honored to work in criminal justice reform. It's been an honor of mine because I'm one that believes that conservatives are really well suited to understanding what our government does, what they do well, and what they can do to improve. I've been, a longtime friend of Senator Mike Lee's, and we used to speak about some of the issues in the criminal justice system. And he used to always say that he was engaged in criminal justice reform, not in spite of being a conservative, but because of it. And I think it has largely to do with the ability to try to keep our government in check, but also an interest in preserving humanity and utilizing both our faith and our beliefs, humanity. Great prosecutors and former prosecutors and friends and people that are leading the way in this country. And so I'm honored to be with you. Introduce to you Daniel Tamlin, who is the Kentucky. Reform out there, and a great alma mater. He was an attorney with the law firm of Frost Brown Todd in Louisville. His professional experience includes serving as a law clerk to Judge Gregory Van Tatenhove of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Kentucky, and practicing law at Stites and Harrison in Louisville, and serving as legal counsel to Senator Mitch McConnell, whom I had some very fond memories of working with Senator McConnell when I was in the Senate. We also have and are pleased to have with us the York County District Attorney, David Sunday. I think you'll be impressed with what both of these gentlemen are doing. David Sunday is the elected District Attorney for York County, Pennsylvania. He's a veteran of the United States Navy. David has a finance degree from Penn State University and a Juris Doctorate from Widener School of Law. In his address the day he was sworn into office, he highlighted two major priorities: the heroin epidemic and his desire to seek justice regardless of what that looked like. In his service, he has prioritized public-private partnerships, serving on the board of directors for the York Opioid Collaborative, the Criminal Justice Advisory Board, York County Prison Board, and Better York Board. I've had the privilege to follow David and what he's done in his career and some of the things he's implemented, and it's truly an honor to have him, and I think you'll all be impressed. Last but not least, my good friend Matt Whitaker, who I will tell you, he provided a little bit of bio, each of them did, and he was very humble in my opinion. You may all know that Matt served as the acting United States Attorney General from November 2018 to February 2019, and you may know that was not an easy time to be the acting Attorney General, and he handled it and deflected that responsibility with grace, in my opinion. Made some great decisions. He was appointed to that position by the president, and I had the opportunity to certainly work with him as we worked hard on the First Step Act and trying to implement the White House's policies. I will tell you that I give Matt a hard time, but this is a man who I know from being former United States Attorney as well in Iowa. He's one of the few people in my life that I have contributed to his political campaigns. I believe in him a lot, and I'll tell you why. I wish I didn't have to be so honest on this, but anybody who knows that perhaps the most pivotal play is coming their way to send their football team to the Rose Bowl and doesn't drop that pass, that's impressive. Tells you that he can survive under pressure, and I'm honored to have him as a friend and colleague. So we are going to get started. I do want to give each of the panelists a little opportunity to address you all and to indicate why they think it's important for this message and for conservatives and for prosecutors to have a significant role in criminal justice reform. Matt, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Brett, and thanks for that introduction. I have served at many different levels in the federal system, both as U.S. Attorney, as Chief of Staff at the Department of Justice for the Attorney General, and also as the Acting Attorney General. And I was there while the First Step Act was being negotiated with members of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees and the White House, and I was one of the folks at the table during those discussions. I've also, since I left the Department of Justice, been involved in continuing sort of the implementation of the First Step Act and looking for ways that we can do the right thing and follow. Again, some of this is using reason and common sense, but it's also following the law, which is the 35 factors that sort of is the policy statement of federal sentencing. And I've worked also very carefully on reviewing some of the issues relating to executive pardons and the executive pardon power exercised by the president. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion. The Attorney General and the York County Prosecutor have a lot more experience at the state level than I do. Especially, each state is sort of unique in its criminal justice systems and both criminal justice reform and making sure that those that need to be in prison are, and those that have been rehabilitated and are no longer a threat are not. I always, someone that's became a friend through this whole process, in addition to Brett, is Alice Marie Johnson, who is really an exemplar of someone that had been sentenced to life in prison with no hope of getting out under the federal sentencing guidelines, and the president granted her clemency, commutation of her sentence, and she has been out for over a year now and has really been an exemplary person in the criminal justice and the incarceration reform efforts. And I know Brett's worked with her as well. And so, I'm excited for this discussion. A lot of my comments are going to be limited to the federal system, which is a system I know. I have practiced in the Iowa state court system, but I think for this purposes, probably I'll mostly keep my comments to the federal system. So thanks, Brett.
Thank you, Matt. It's great you bring up Alice. I was just texting with Alice Johnson, who is, she's remarkable. And I think she is perhaps, the real reason why you saw President Trump engage a lot. I think he was able to see who she was, and it probably pushed her quite a bit. We're going through a tough time with COVID-19. I'd like to turn next to Daniel and then to David. Have you addressed the same issues of prosecutors and their role, but also maybe address just briefly, since we're all at home and we're doing our best to survive this, what role prosecutors may have right now in regards to that issue that's facing us, and then we'll turn to some other issues.
Well, thanks, Brett, for having me, and obviously I'm honored to be a part of this virtual panel with such distinguished gentlemen. I've obviously think the world of General Whitaker and have followed his career and grateful for his service to this country. And Brett, when I was serving as Senator McConnell's legal counsel, I got to hear some of those discussions that you and Senator Lee and General McCasey and others were having as it relates to criminal justice reform on the federal level, and was very persuaded by a lot of those conversations, and certainly enjoyed getting to hear you in that context. I think, and I haven't had a lot of time to visit with District Attorney Sunday, but recognize that he, along with General Whitaker and you, Brett, to be here as in my judgment, of drug-related offenses and convictions. And that was in Eastern Kentucky, where we saw a lot of abuse of prescription drugs and illicit drugs as well. And so that was sort of my first entree, if you will, into this whole issue and challenge. And then had an opportunity in Senator McConnell's office, again, having heard you and Senator Lee speak the challenges that exist in our system, where the inequities exist, and how we might legislation. I was trying at the same time to marry that with my responsibility in the senator's office to be the liaison, if you will, between the office and our local law enforcement community, that we're having to confront this challenge as well in terms of the drugs that have been pouring into our borders here in the Commonwealth. And so marrying those two conversations, being mindful of the challenges and the issues that the law enforcement community have had, but also with the idea that there has been a change in the conversation, ultimately became something that was time in his office. I then returned to Kentucky in 2017 and became working at Frost Brown Todd, became the spokesman for Smart on Crime, which is really a coalition of groups that have a lot of disparate interests, but on criminal justice reform and trying to progress on that front, were aligned. And so saw the challenges with having, trying to put forward a big package of criminal justice reform efforts, seeing frankly fail, and then seeing small iterations of that package make its way through the legislature. I've been here in the Attorney General's office and seeing what works and seeing what hasn't worked. And now, as the Attorney General, that I have the responsibility to be an advocate for our law enforcement community, whether that be our prosecutors or those who are the boots on the ground, if you will, our police officers and our state police, our detectives, all those that are really having to confront what until this COVID-19 had really, in my judgment, been the public safety challenge of our lifetime. You mentioned COVID-19 and how we are having to adapt. The prosecutors that I've had the fortune of talking to, and I should say there is a delineation between our office and the prosecutors of oversight, but mostly it's a partnership. The Commonwealths and county attorneys who are prosecutors, our county prosecutors, and then our judicial district prosecutors, their own fiefdoms. But we do have a prosecutorial advisory council that is a partnership between the AG's office and our prosecutors. And it has allowed me an insight into how they're having to deal with COVID-19. Our court system, for all intents and purposes, is shut down through May 1 because of the pandemic. That was a decision that was made by the administrative, with the exception of some emergency situations. If a protective order of some sort needs to be filed or needs to be moved forward, then the court is open for those sorts of things. But I've really seen our prosecutors step up and try to be creative, even in small ways, whether it be buying meals for our law enforcement community or sort of thinking outside the box in terms of making small commentary in light of the pandemic. How are we protecting those that are currently within our jail and prison facilities? So it really has been an all-hands-on-deck approach here in Kentucky as it relates to the law enforcement community and our prosecutors, being mindful of the current situation that we're in, wanting to do everything that we can to flatten the curve. But I have really been pleased to see the conversation around criminal justice reform from a few different vantage points. And again, I'm grateful to be a part of this panel.
Thanks, Daniel. David?
Yes, thank you, Brett. I just want to say it is an honor to the distinguished panel. I view my role in this discussion a little different in that as the elected DA for a county, I'm really in the front lines of a lot of what we see every day. And by way of background, and I think it's interesting because I know that all the panelists really pull on their experiences as they face these challenges. For purposes of those listening, my experiences and my history, I've been a prosecutor for a little over close to 12 years. I've been the elected DA for 2 years. And prior to that, I actually went to law school at night. And prior to that, I served in the United States Navy for 4 years active duty. And so in coming to this position as an elected DA in I'll say a mid-sized county with a population of around 450,000 people, I was faced immediately with challenges that were unique, that at the time I thought were unique, but these are challenges that are faced by every, I think, elected DA across the country. And that is the need to handle a influx of, for me, it's around 10,000 criminal cases a year with a finite budget. And that's something that has really been a challenge for me. And it's been a challenge for, I know, probably most elected DAs across the country. And with that in mind, we were able to come up with a lot of different initiatives that brought us right here to the COVID-19 pandemic that we are now facing. And I say that because COVID-19 has affected me personally in this office. I'm going to say in two different ways. The first way is obviously the immediate need on our part to handle issues with prisoners. And so by way of background, around 5 weeks, county warden and I sat down and he explained to me the situation that he was facing with regard to a potential community safety issue as a result of COVID-19 and what would happen if prisoners became the first thing we had to deal with. And what we decided to do here in York is we worked with the prison and we put together a methodology that we utilize to assess people. And so for those that aren't familiar with Pennsylvania, every county has, and for counties of my size, I'm on what's called the prison board. And through that, I've had a tremendous amount of collaboration with our warden. And what I realized very quickly was a lot of people in the community didn't quite understand what the potential impact of that could be if, in fact, a pandemic went through the prison. And so we worked with a methodology by which we identified individuals who were on work release, and we furloughed them. Some were paroled, some were potentially furloughed for 30 days. And I think it's important, coming from especially the perspective of a frontline prosecutor, everything we do has to be viewed through the lens of public safety and also the impact on victims. In this process, we spent a lot of time working with victims. Every single person who potentially would be furloughed for a small time period, around 30 days, we personally reached out to the victims in those cases, and so of sort of what we've had to deal with COVID-19. The second part, and I think this is a largely ties directly into what I'm assuming, what I know we're going to talk about today, is what the impact of COVID-19, in particular, the impact of what will happen to our state and local budgets on the effect of different initiatives that a lot of smaller counties like myself are currently working on. And so that's something I hope to talk about today because, you know, with regard to what we are all working on, that's the place that I have today on the local level. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation, looking forward to discussing the issues that I know all DAs face across the country.
Thanks, David. I appreciate those thoughtful responses. I'll tell you, I had a lawyer call me up the other day and ask why, you know, prosecutors are getting involved in criminal justice reform, and should they really do that? And it reminded me, you know, my first boss as a prosecutor was a U.S. attorney named Paul Warner. Matt Whitaker knows him well, and Paul, you know, he was certainly old school, but great man, good friend of mine. But he pulled us all in as new prosecutors and he said, look, your job is to put people in jail. That's it. We're not social workers. You let other people work that. And it was, I think, a product authority from the Department of Justice to try to offer him a 35-year sentence, which he pled to. And I've thought long and hard. And now that issue has been fixed in the First Step Act now, speaking of those crimes with a firearm. But what is the role for prosecutors in criminal justice reform in charging decisions? Is it doing more community, and is it more than just putting people in jail now? Turn to you, Matt, first.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I mean, there's so many things to talk about. I really listening carefully to the introductions from all the panelists, and we the victims of these crimes. I think that's so important, and that's to some extent wearing the white hat of justice and doing justice requires us to be their advocate. And as you all know, when you charge crimes, you have sort of the victim and their experience, and they have a voice in the federal system. States have given victims voices in this process. As I think about the role of a prosecutor, first of all, remember we're the executive branch. We're executing the laws. The Congress and the federal and the state systems have said what the law is. Our job is to execute the law, and I think as prosecutors, we also are responsible to whether it's our state, whether it's our judicial district, whether it's our county or municipality. We have to be responsive to what are the crimes and what is affecting the quality of life, what our Constitution guarantees and what's articulated in Declaration of Independence, and that is sort of our key tenets that we're trying to make sure that we are, and to make sure that they're not subjected to crime, neighborhoods, and that everyone has a right to freedom and to express that. So, as prosecutors, we have to execute the law. Without parole, we need to make sure that that we exercise all of the powers, and that includes the executive power to for clemency. And that's I see it as a 360-degree circle. It's to be evaluated by all the members, and we should never just warehouse people who are ultimately rehabilitated and ready to join society. And I point to Alice as a prime example, but there's many Alice's out there. Again, I'm not saying 1,000 current residents of BOP are Alice Johnson, because that's not true. And I know, Brett, you can point to examples as I can of folks that deserve to be behind bars for a long period of time because of the heinous nature of their crimes. We need to make sure that we are looking at these as individual experiences and that we do offer a second chance where a second chance is appropriate.
Great point. Daniel?
Well, I will certainly echo the sentiment that Matt just mentioned about, first, an initial matter for prosecutors. We have to be very concerned about victims. I remember being on a panel conversation at another conference and talking about criminal justice reform. Conference or panel concluded, a former attorney general came up to me and said, not once during that conversation law enforcement conversation all the time, and I appreciate Dave and Matt bringing that to the forefront of this conversation because it's critically important. And in my judgment, any large conversation about criminal justice reform can fall apart pretty quickly if you don't have victims and victims' interest groups at the table of these conversations. What I've seen here in Kentucky from our line prosecutors and from our commonwealths and county attorneys is that, as Matt noted, business and are there to execute the laws of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. But where I've seen some of our prosecutors and Commonwealth's attorneys, Rob Sanders, who comes to mind, where they do take a little more license is on the back end component. So there are partnerships, and a lot of this, as Dave alluded to earlier, is contingent upon what the budget of a particular office is and how much room do they have. But you'll see that they establish partnerships with local reentry facilities or programs. And our local prosecutors have a pretty big pulpit, or bully pulpit, if you will, and can go to great lengths to promote those sorts of programs and in really not only support, but also bolster the programs just by the virtue of them willing to stand up and talk about what do we do to reacclimate people into society in a responsible manner so that they're able to provide for themselves and provide for their families. In Kentucky, we have a recidivism rate of roughly 40%, I think, after 5 years. Part is to make sure that there are programs in place, and that's one, we talk a little bit about the First Step Act. One of the great parts of the First Step Act is that it tries to put in place some of those on the back end in our Bureau of Prisons to help people when they get out, they step outside of those prison walls. Kentucky, we need to be about doing the same thing, and I know there's efforts being undertaken to help with that. I know our governor has talked a lot about that, but our prosecutors really have an opportunity, and again, I've seen them be in the northern part of the Commonwealth, central or eastern or west, really step up to the plate.
About that. With regard to cases that we actually prosecute, our goal first and foremost, our goal is to seek the truth. And I think that's really important for people to remember. What does it look like in the DA's office? What happens every day? Well, every day, prosecutors view cases and they determine what the truth is. And sometimes the truth can equal a very long prison sentence. Other times the truth might mean something vastly different. So through the course of doing this job and through our goal and our efforts to seek the truth, we've uncovered a lot of, I'm going to say, areas where we as prosecutors have moved into. In an effort, a long-term goal of keeping our community safe, and also of primarily of ensuring that victims are not forgotten, that victims are taken care of, and that their concerns are listened to. And what I mean by that is when you start, even at the very beginning, charges happen. In York County, and I also want to say that they say necessity is the mother of invention. And necessity has driven a lot of the innovations that we've done here in York County, and I have no doubt many DAs across the country do. Starting from the very beginning with regard to pretrial diversion, we do everything we can to identify individuals that, and these are all through evidence-based practices, that we can identify individuals that just don't belong in a prison. There are many, many people that absolutely need to go to jail for the benefit of society and for the safety of society. However, there are many, many people that don't belong in a prison cell. And so what we do is we work very hard to identify those individuals that could benefit from mental health treatment, from drug and alcohol treatment, from different types of public health, I'll say, treatment that we can identify to keep these people from being long time. We identify them prior to filing charges, and we as an office have moved into that non-traditional area. In addition to that, we are also partners in our York Opioid Collaborative. That's allowed us, I know, I don't want to speak for the other panelists, but I know when I went to law school, I was never taught about addiction. I was about what addiction does to the family. I was never taught about ACEs and about childhood trauma and about what that does to criminal activity in my community. These are all things that we've learned on the job, and we've had to implement all these to keep our community safe. And so, in addition to the York Opioid Collaborative, where we're actually partnering with doctors, where we partner with treatment providers, with people all throughout the community to do everything we can to decrease opioid deaths. At the same time, we've also expanded to working with individuals. Some of you may have read the book "Don't Shoot" by David Kennedy, and so we're partners here. And so we identify people potentially could be shooters. We pull them in, we talk to them. We do everything we can to try to keep crime from occurring in the first place. We have a Stepping Up initiative where we identify people with mental health issues, okay, and we try to get them the mental health, them in a prison cell, because I know from the perspective of a county DA, what I've seen is and what we don't want to have happen is our prisons turn into long-term care facilities for people with severe mental health illnesses. Furthermore, as we move through the process, let's go to the end of it. And we in York County, I'm very proud, and I know that I'm the one speaking right now in this virtual town hall, but I've no doubt that thousands of DAs could easily be telling this exact same story. And that is that we're partners, we're actual partners in our county reentry coalition, because we've identified that if we cannot get people jobs, then they are going to turn right back to crime, and that will increase the amount of crime. And so, with that being said, the role of the district attorney isn't what people see. And this is what I learned. It's nothing like you see on TV. We spend hours and hours and days of time poring over studies to decrease crime because prosecuting a case, we're very good at that too. And however, the goal is to keep people home, to reunite families, and to do everything we can to make sure children have great futures. And so I never would have imagined that these are the type of these areas would be what keeps me up at night when I became the elected DA, but it truly is. And I think that's important for us all to remember.
Hey,
Well,
Brett,
Matt. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
One thing I wanted to follow up on, because it was really something that while we were doing the First Step Act and negotiating, that I kept coming back to, and that is the idea of evidence-based things that we have data and statistics that reduce recidivism. Because as you know, the more we can reduce recidivism, the more we can reduce the number of people that get these enhanced sentences, especially in the federal system, because once you have or two, then obviously those enhanced based on the points and everything else under the sentencing guidelines, which are times are compelling as well. And so I think, when we looked at BOP, and there's plenty of studies at BOP, and we found that a couple things. One was the RDAP program, the drug treatment, was very important to predicting recidivism. And declining recidivism, and as well as the prison industries, having a job and learning a trade. And so I think to some extent we use that evidence to really push in the First Step Act to get kind of more funding and attention to the things that we know work. Now, is that is it perfect? Are we talking? We're dealing with the individual, so every individual is different. But we know that on the whole, those two programs, especially reduce recidivism at the federal level. I assume the states obviously have funding issues uniquely in all 50 states, but those are things we need the evidence. And if there are programs, and this is what I would often say to the folks inside at the White House and inside of the Department of Justice, if there are programs that we think might work, but we don't have, let's put one in. Let's pick one prison in the BOP system and do a pilot program and get some data and find out whether or not we can find other ways, other things, other training, other programming that can reduce recidivism. Because ultimately, you reduce recidivism, you reduce crime.
Yeah, I mean, great points that you raise. It's almost overwhelming the number of points that we can kind of discuss. They had prisons they were planning. Took a chance and made some changes, and kind of like you addressed, David, they did it because they were compelled to do it, and they started looking at recidivism and looking at, rewarding individuals for reducing their risk of recidivism. And in the end, they ended up $1 billion in closing several facilities or not building other facilities. And how did they do it? They did it by what Matt has talked about and what you were willing to do, and that is doing something different or courageous. When I became a prosecutor, I became very quickly aware of a couple of issues. One, there was disparity in the system. We know that, for example, the crack, powder, cocaine disparity that was there. We also know, if you look at Alice Johnson, you look at Matthew Charles, you start to see where impacts in our minority communities that you could not explain without understanding the perception of a prosecutor. I really want to get to what your thoughts are on prosecutors being willing to identify these, whether it's through the data or otherwise, identifying problems and issues and then resolving those, address those. One quick anecdote before you address it. I talked to a prosecutor who was in St. Louis, and this was just a very small area. Being very frustrated about just sort of the revolving door, but also the people of color that in his community that were being arrested over and over again. And he and several police officers did something pretty courageous. They would write it all up, put it together, and before they would present it to the grand jury or present it for a charging, a document to the court, they would actually go meet with the family, and they'd present all their evidence to the individual and indicate that they're going to charge him. He makes some changes right then and there. They ended up having to charge very few of those individuals because that individual had something different. It was an alternative to incarceration that was presented to him, and it almost, this officer said it just jolted them kind of out of their funk and some of their behavior. But it changed in that small little area. Number of prosecutions, the number of people they were incarcerating, and they saw their crime rates go down. So what can prosecutors do to identify these, to address some of the issues like that?
I'll go last this time, Brett. I'll let Daniel, who's very smart on these.
From the 30,000 foot level here in the AG's office, what I think how this issue has manifested itself most recently is in our bail system, and it's not specific to, doesn't break down on racial lines, but monetary lines in the arbitrariness in some perceived manner or perceived ways that you have a bail system. We have a cash bail system here, in Kentucky. And the fact that someone who has committed a pretty heinous violent crime, sometimes can get out on bail simply because to do so. Whereas someone who conducted and acted in a non-violent manner has to stay in jail in that system. So there has been, as it exists, and so there has been across the board address that to situation context. Where the rub has been is how much discretion where the rub has been is how much discretion do you continue to give judges in that process about making any determination about who needs to stay while they await trial, So that's where who can go out. So that's where the conversation disproportionate impact has occurred here. In Kentucky, and I know there are prosecutors in Kentucky, and I know there are prosecutors here needs to be some change. Who agree that there needs to be some change. Again, how much the challenge discretion of how much in this situation as in this situation. That's where we've seen it. That's where we've seen it here in Kentucky. Most prevalent here.
Well, AG Whitaker was so gracious to go last. I'll jump in next here. A couple points I want to make. The first point is, as prosecutors, we will not be afraid of challenging ourselves and of taking time to talk to other people that that you may not typically think would have something to offer. And what I mean by we have to get down into the weeds in a sense. You have to understand what's going on in your community, and you have to understand what everybody's needs are. One of the things that has really been a tremendous positive impact for us here in York is the collaborative nature of the way we do business. That takes a tremendous amount of time and energy to really get to know the people and working with probation, all the different police departments, law enforcement, the treatment providers, all the different, mental. And then once you understand each other and understand what your needs are, it makes it much easier to work through, because we're talking about specific issues today. However, if you have a system in place that makes it easier to react, then as these things come up, such as COVID-19, such as the opioid epidemic, such as, the addition on the path, it makes it much easier. So I would definitely recommend that getting out there, talking to people, understanding your partners, and being true partners in that we do. I think that's absolutely critical. Another point I want to make here is that when you look at the job of a prosecutor, it oftentimes, we can be fearful of change. And as long as it's data driven, and as long as it's something that you can show actually works, as this discussion was, and multiple times throughout, we've heard the term reform. We have to be very careful, because the reality is, reform has taken on a word unto itself, but we as human beings, as prosecutors, whatever form every day, by growing and learning and becoming better at what we do. And I think that we all need to take time to work together and understand how we can do this, because I truly think that every single person, I know for a fact, everyone on this call, I know that every DA that I've ever worked with, regardless of where you're from or the type of community you see, everybody has the same goal, which is keeping people safe, making sure victims' voice, and making sure that we have a community where kids can grow up and be healthy. So I know that was kind of broad, but I thought it was important to make those comments.
No, I do too. Anything else, Matt?
Yeah, well, so one of the things I've been thinking about in this discussion is, I've had the unique honor to serve with essentially two classes of U.S. attorneys. What I would call the sort of Ashcroft, Gonzalez-Mukasey U.S. attorneys, and then the Sessions U.S. attorneys under President Trump. And each one of them have been charged with making their communities better. And think about how we do, as U.S. attorneys, make those charging decisions and address the unique needs of our communities. I have to, think about that, we hold ourselves out as doing the worst of the worst. We're doing the gun crimes, especially both in the Bush administration and the Trump administration, reducing violent crime. We also, did a lot of drugs and immigration, in my district, in the Southern District of Iowa. And, some of that, if you're doing the worst of the worst, how do you judge the worst of the worst? One is there's obviously the offense conduct, but you also have criminal history. And I think, unfortunately, the criminal history sometimes reflects the overall history of our country, and where, communities have deployed law enforcement. For example, if you think about I always remember in Des Moines, where the Southern District of Iowa is, we had a DEA task force, we had a HIDTA, high intensity drug trafficking task force, we had a Des Moines PD task force, and we had a Metro task force, essentially the county and suburbs. We're trying to address local street corner dealing. So we had all these drug task force running around. I was always trying to reconcile and get them to work together, get them to deconflict. And you know what? We had a lot of drug cases, because that's where we were deploying our resources to some extent. And it's the old, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And not that I'm suggesting that there isn't justice and honor in drug enforcement, but again, it's we always have to look at the how we deploy these assets. I remember one of the deputy attorney generals I served with in the Bush administration, just said, we're still deployed like we're fighting the Miami Vice cocaine importation war. There's so many drug prosecutors in Miami, and that problem has moved. And so, of course, you're going to continue to see these types of things if you're not smart in managing your resources as well. And so I think we have to look at both, sort of how criminal history is developed, through those types of enforcement efforts, and have, really kind of think about it for a minute instead of just sort of assuming this is the way it always is. We're going to do as many drug cases as we can with the resources we have. Think about, are we currently deployed to fight the challenges? Because I know we have resources out to places like York County, Pennsylvania, for opioid prosecutions. We did so much to try to arrest the 70,000 drug overdose deaths, many of them opioids, while I was at the Department of Justice in the Trump administration. And so, to some extent, it's being able to be nimble and deploy the assets to where the threats are. Again, with the goal, these experienced prosecutors, it's just to keep our community safe from whatever the threats may be.
So I want to get to a couple other questions from the audience, which I've been trying. One of them I think is very timely, and that's on prosecutor accountability. While I was a prosecutor, certainly we enjoyed the benefit of absolute immunity and the strength of the immunity provisions. Accountability, you start to see what happens when there isn't sufficient prosecutor accountability. You saw the prosecution of Senator Ted Stevens and the misconduct that was there, and then you look at what has happened here and the allegations in in some of the prosecutions or in some of the efforts of the FBI. And we all know and love agents and police officers and know that the vast majority are terrific, wonderful, hard work individuals. But I think that we're almost at an all-time low in terms of the public's trust, especially with what the Trump administration has gone through and individuals like General Flynn or others. But it happens on the state level as well. I just read about a Fifth Circuit opinion about the prosecutor in one of the counties in New Orleans, and who has lost some of the immunity arguments that he would have because he was issuing false sort of subpoenas and threatening jail to individuals who didn't follow them. So while we have at the same time the sea to defend and to ensure its safety, there's a real sort of brewing out there, and that's a lack of confidence. So do we need to do something more with prosecutorial accountability, and what would you suggest? I'll let you go first, David.
I'll just jump in with regard to, there's a couple points I want to make. I think that we all need to have the courage to look in the mirror and ask, what can we do to better our profession? One of the things that I'm very proud of here is the collaborative nature of our relationship with our U.S. Attorney's Office here in the Middle District of Pennsylvania. Attorney here, his name's Dave Freed, a former DA. We work together almost every single day. And in addition to that, with our Attorney General's office. And then you look at our Pennsylvania District Attorney Association. So I throw those all out there for a reason. When you work more with other people and you collaborate and you train and you understand the rules of ethics and you are out in the community every day, then you're putting yourself really in a position where incidents like what you said in New Orleans, things like that just shouldn't happen. And if something like that does happen, then there's certainly a mechanism in place to remedy that situation. That we cannot fix every single problem of the world. However, what we can do is put ourselves in a position in which we will be able to minimize as much as humanly possible incidents like that through proper transparency in the way you do business, through zealous advocacy with defense counsel, and through just doing the job the right way. Now, when there's instances where that doesn't happen, then that needs to be taken care of because it reflects poorly on the whole profession. And so that's a starting point. Another second point I want to make really quick is it is so critical to have the collaborative relationships like I talked about earlier. So throughout our community here in York, and it takes a long time to do it, but we have from the Black Ministers Association to our different veterans associations. And when you are out in the community that often and you are talking to everybody and you understand what they're going through, it really puts you in a position where you don't find yourself so far removed from the realities of life that you make that may cause, that ultimately will cause issues for you.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, I'll say here in Kentucky, the first sort of line of defense for the here is our commonwealths and county attorneys, local prosecutors are, they have to stand up before the voters in their specific jurisdictions. They are not doing right by their citizenry. Then there's an option to remove them through that process. There's also a little bit of a quirk within our I don't say quirk, but a provision within state law that actually gives the AG's office some quasi ability to go into a specific prosecutor's office in the event that there's some behavior there or conduct that's occurring in that particular office that essentially means that these. So we constantly monitor that for just situational where there's a need for this office to get engaged on that level. There's also the ability on the corruption side for our office to step in if there are some issues there. But by and large, I've been really proud of prosecutors' work here in the Commonwealth. Well, to piggyback off something Dave said, I think it is terribly important for our prosecutors and our law enforcement community more broadly to be engaged with every part of every facet of our community. And so that's making sure that there are good relationships in some of our urban areas. Those are often conversations that occur, historical issues. And we've got a wonderful U.S. attorney in the Western District here, Russell Coleman, who is relentless in his efforts to make sure that he has established a strong relationship within that community. Our U.S. attorney in the Eastern District, Rob Duncan, is doing the very same thing. I, as an AG, especially one that is in position, having been the first African American Attorney General here in the Commonwealth, feel an additional responsibility to make sure that I'm doing everything I possibly can to make sure that people feel comfortable with law enforcement and helping communities. COVID-19 has obviously had an impact on our ability to do that here in the last few months, but I imagine a scenario where we will be out again in the communities of color here, making sure that folks know that we are accountable to the people that are here to serve everyone and have to do that as part of their oath when they are sworn in. And so it is a conversation that continues daily. It's always evolving, and things, you're always striving to have a more perfect relationship. It just occurs with some good blood, sweat, and tears and being intentional about it.
Any thoughts, Matt?
From your time at DOJ, and my experience seeing it both from the U.S. Attorney's Office up to the Attorney General's office out to the U.S. Attorney's offices, the prosecutors at DOJ is really the gold standard. I've just seen it play out so many times where there have been allegations of misconduct and it's been investigated by OPR and others. And I think that they have a pretty good system in place. And I've seen their work product both as me and as my time as chief of staff. And so, but at the same time, ultimately, and I tell you, in some of the things I've been involved in and looked at, oftentimes it's a question of judgment, and exercising sound. And I know everybody on this on this panel has exercised that judgment, and you know how hard it is sometimes, and you have to be right and be sort of within the law and within your professional duties. But I can't emphasize AUSAs or new U.S. attorneys just making sure they understand the power that they have and what it requires to exercise that professional judgment day in and day out.
Brought this up. I'm going to push back a little bit on all three of you. A little bit of a couple of experiences. On the case, of course, that would be simple and easy enough, and that would obviously occur. The judge, though, scratched his head and said, I think you might have violated the state wiretapping provisions, and I think you violated, but I don't see a remedy in law that I can address this issue. Now, you can refer the bar or things of that nature, but that it was an eye-opening experience. One of the first cases I defended after being a prosecutor, similar case that occurred to a colleague of mine. They became aware that the defendant had set up an email account to communicate with his own attorney, and they received in discovery back from the U.S. Attorney's Office all of the emails between the defendant and his lawyers. When they raised the issue, the federal judge, I have a lot of respect for, said, if this certainly would have sanctioned this side for what they did, having those confidential emails, viewing them, there was a strategy involved. I think well-meaning prosecutors, I think judgment, it comes down to judgment, like you said, Matt. I think we've moved into a phase where we might be a win at all costs, and the other side are the bad guys, and we're the good than ever before. And I say that because my conversations with Ed Meese, for example, he said that when he was Attorney General, he used to call up attorneys and congratulate them when they declined to bring a case. And he loved to see that because he thought that he needed to be able to remind them of that, and that is the judgment has to be impeccable because of how much is on the line. I still am not so sure there isn't by way of accountability. So I'd love to talk to you all about it further, and maybe there's some solutions, but appreciate that thoughtful discussion. I want to move on to one other aspect, and you raised what's going on with COVID right now. Do you think prosecutors have a role in pushing mayors, governors, and others, the Bureau of Prison even, to do more and to be more aggressive at pulling people out, letting them go into violent and may fit a category? Because we see what happened in Marion, for example. Over 75% of the inmates now have tested positive for COVID. What can prosecutors do in that regard? Start with you, Matt.
Well, I see to some extent a limited role, and I see a constitutional role. I mean, obviously the police powers exercised by governors, but in some their means. Now, that being said, General Barr just talked about how we have to balance our constitutional rights and our freedoms against sort of the state's police power, and I can only imagine General Cameron is thinking about and doing every day, and the advice he's giving to the governor and the governor's council as to what how to address this crisis. I mean, we're again,
no pressure, Daniel. No pressure.
I was about to say Matt's very kind to think we talk every day.
Well, my point is that again, we're not going to prosecute our way out of this pandemic. Real people are suffering, and they're suffering only from the disease, but also this economy, if you look at the unemployment, it's causing cataclysmic, problems for a lot of Americans. And my heart breaks for them because I know, that a lot of people are wondering how they're going to provide for their family. And so, that is where we have to really be smart and use our discretion and not step on people's constitutional rights. And, again, we have a lot of liberties and freedoms. And one of those liberties and freedoms is to make mistakes in our own individual capacities, as long as it's not illegal, prohibited by law. And so I'm a little bit lean towards the side of liberty. But at the same time, I don't want somebody being reckless and getting me and my family sick. So that's, again, there's these balances. I'm watching it on a daily basis. I don't envy the people having to make these decisions.
Yeah, I agree with you on the liberty side. I'm mortified to see, the police power now being used, the arrest of the mother in Idaho, or children on the playground. I get responses from people all the time that, previously wanted nothing to do with criminal justice for reform, for example, saying, we got to do something about this. This is outrageous. This is police, run amok. And I say, welcome to criminal justice reform. We're glad to have you. Let's weigh in together on this, because it's such a challenging time right now. Any other thoughts on that, Daniel or David?
Yeah, I'll just say, we reevaluate how we operate in this, what's now become a new normal, which is here in the Commonwealth. The governor had emergency powers under 39A of our Kentucky revised statutes. And so it is a constant conversation here about where we fit in this pattern of executive orders that issued, some, as Matt astutely noted, triggering or at least touching on constitutional rights. There's a great conversation here being had now about in-person church services or drive-in church services, and how does the First Amendment protect that in the midst of a pandemic, which we all acknowledge is of great concern to elected representatives and leaders and appointed individuals as well, and just concerned citizens. So we're constantly having to reevaluate how we play a role in the midst of this. As it relates to the specific question about prosecutors, I point back to one of our prosecutors in Northern Kentucky, Rob Sanders, who is mindful of, and I think this is a great point about, and Dave, I think you've talked about this a little bit, about being concerned about victims and public safety before there are any grand pronouncements about the release of individuals. Our governor actually has released individuals in light of the pandemic for concerns about, or for health concerns related to the COVID-19. Our office has not taken an active comment on that, but I have seen, again, Rob Sanders and others comment about if we can do it safely, and if there's adequate monitoring for some of these nonviolent or folks that are at the tail end of their prison sentences, letting them back out so that they can care for themselves, or if they're aging individuals who are in a higher risk pool, allowing those people out too. So it is appropriate, again, to be a part of that conversation, to have that conversation, to have our governor, making those determinations. One of the things I would caution in making these decisions is, and it points back to Dave and what Matt are saying, is that I do think victims and our local prosecutors should be consulted before those decisions are made. You start to hear from some of these prosecutors that they were surprised by some of the releases that occurred. So that's a challenge as well. But I know in good faith that people are working, and not every step is going to be a right step. And you understand that our folks are trying to do the best they can, especially in light of circumstances.
Two thoughts here. Now, as prosecutors, we have an obligation to balance the rehabilitative needs of the defendant, the impact of the crime on the victim, the gravity of the offense, and the effect on public safety. And that framework is something that we can apply really to any situation. Applying that to the COVID-19, and in particular with what's happening in a prison, you just sort of overlay that on top of these decisions that have to be made. And we thought it was very important, and I have no doubt that many DAs do, and that is the very first thing we have to do is ensure that all of those four goals are met. And by doing that, that allowed us here on the local to work locally with our prison to identify specific individuals after consultation with the victim in every single case, to furlough them for a short time period with GPS tracking or GPS monitor, and everything we have to do to ensure the public safety and ensure that the victims are part of this conversation, but also ensuring that the prison is safe, because the health and safety of a prison can directly impact the health and safety of the neighborhood and area around it. And as Mr. Whitaker said earlier, being empathetic, we have to have empathy, and we have to also remember that we have the right to protect the constitutional rights of every citizen, regardless of whether you're inside of a prison or outside. And in addition to that, many people don't understand that a lot of prisons don't have hospitals. And this was with a lot of people, because people think that for whatever reason that there's hospitals and prisons, and when people get sick in a prison, they're going into the hospital, and that impacts society as well. And so, part one. There's a second part, and I know not sure how much time we have left, but I want to make this clear that with regard to COVID-19, what keeps me up at night the most, by far, is my fear that as a result of COVID-19 and as a result of shortfalls, that the tremendous amount of amazing initiatives and progress that we've all made is not only going to come to a halt, but could revert. And I say that because we have lowered our prison population. We have lowered the amount of crime that's occurring, money that has to be spent, which are all conservative principles. And we've done that through initiatives that took funding and still require funding. And so my biggest concern is that we're going to go backwards, because if all of a sudden we aren't addressing mental health, if we aren't addressing substance abuse, if we aren't adequately involved in a robust reentry coalition, and what we're doing is we're creating or increasing the criminogenics that will result in additional crime, families being torn apart, more money having to be spent, and we could go right back to where we were before. And so somehow we'll push through, and that the collective we in law enforcement and in prosecution, regardless of the level, are going to come together and do what we can to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Very, very thoughtful, David. I appreciate that. And we are getting short on time, so I want to thank Attorney General Whitaker and Attorney General Cameron and David. I'm glad you had sort of the word, because you were able to capture, I think, what's really evident, and that how seriously you take your role, how open you are to thinking outside the box, but at the same time being mindful that can create a better criminal justice system. That doesn't mean every aspect. What it means is there's aspects that can be improved, fine-tuned, and maybe if there is broken areas, can repair or eliminate that. It's my great honor to work on part of it, to work with great groups like the American Conservative Union and Right on Crime. There are individuals who, most of them have somehow touched the criminal justice system. Either they were prior, in their other life, they were former prosecutors, or they were elected officials, and many of them even former inmates who have come out. And all of you probably know, folks like David Safavian or Sean Hopwood, Pat Nolan. These are powerful, amazing voices that what policies get implemented. I encourage all of you to continue down this, and I'm excited to watch what you do. And I know that Matt Whitaker is going to be, at the forefront of leading our country, and I'm honored to be able to watch that, and hope I can be a part of it or help any of you. Grateful for all the guests and all that they contribute and the questions that we got. And with that, we'll close until next time, and tell you thank you.
Thank you. Good to be
Thank you
here.
very much.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.